let us begin.
Hi, welcome back to Political Noise. I'm Hannah from Department of Music, and this is...
I'm Koshka from the Department of Philosophy.
Cool,
and we
go
have
for it.
put together a playlist for every episode, which we will chat about. And this week's playlist, I was just saying to Hannah, has been quite an intense experience to listen to in the current moment of uprisings against police violence, police racism in the United States. But obviously that is not an issue that's limited to the United States. So a pretty urgent thing to be talking about right now. And really enjoyed the tracks that you put onto the playlist, Hannah, and looking forward to finding out more about them.
Oh, it's exciting. I mean, I think we should just say before we get too far in that obviously we've highlighted the topicality of what we're talking about and that this was agreed weeks before this happened, but also that all the content notes that come with discussions of systemic racism and police brutality and so on are going to apply to the next half an hour. So take that under advisement in terms of when you consume this content. Person out there. Do we want to start with NWA?
Yeah,
I feel like
where better to start?
Where better to start?
They
Do you
say it.
Go for it?
Fuck the police. Okay, fuck the police. So it's a classic. Why is it a classic? I think two things that I really love about that track. One is that it just expresses with an incredible level of kind of detail and sophistication the way that what we see in these kinds of cases of kind of police murdering people of color is not a sort of dysfunction of the system. It's kind of how the system is meant to operate. So it's not an issue of kind of a few bad apples or kind of this is a rogue officer. This is we're kind of dealing with a systemic problem. That's one of the things that track brings out. And the other thing that it brings out with a great deal of humor actually is a kind of will to resist. And so it's thinking about how to fight back, and partly through this kind of like fantasy scenario where it imagines kind of turning a table on an individual police officer or individual police officers, where it's like imagine what it was like if you have this power because you have a gun, because you have all of the kind of like weapons and technologies of coercion at your disposal, and what would it be like if you didn't have those? So partly through that kind of fantasy, but also resistance is not just something that takes place in fantasy. It's also something that's going on right now in reality, and I think that's just incredibly impressive and inspiring, and so I feel like that NWA track kind of is a like flashpoint of solidarity with all these protests, kind of in different times and places. That's
Yeah, absolutely. My favorite thing about the NWA track is the folklore that the FBI wrote to the record label to complain about the content of the song. Allegedly, it's one rogue person, and that it wasn't an official complaint on behalf of the bureau, but it's one of my favorite stories about a protest song where the institution feels personally attacked and writes a complaint rather than doing anything else. But I find it interesting because it was censored in a number of places when it came out, and but actually not as much as you would think in the context. Like, I think it's one of those songs that people assume had more political repercussions than it did, and I think that it's because it speaks to exactly what you're talking about. There's this structure that is kind of undeniable, that is so recognizable, and it was kind of interesting. There's when in the Clash song on the list, where what is the first like principle is like, is it not to be killed, murder is a crime unless it's done by a policeman or an aristocrat. And it is that sentiment, and there's so much of that in that particular microcosmic bit of the early 80s and internationally. And yeah, I find that kind of fascinating about the song, is that like it has this sort of odd status of like having so much social impetus that the FBI didn't feel like they could ignore it. Like that, like whether that's true or not, the idea of understanding a song that is tackling so many complicated things simultaneously, just it gives me the fuzzies.
Well, it is interesting how much effort does go into to censoring critical narratives about police and policing. So an example would be from the UK would be around about 2001. I think there was a documentary that was called Injustice, that was about killings by police in the UK, and kind of following very closely the efforts of some families of people who were killed to have any kind of measure of accountability, or even just finding out what happened to their loved ones through the kind of official channels, and just the kind of years of being like ignored, blocked out, sometimes spied upon. So undercover police officers infiltrated groups of families who were trying to campaign for justice for their loved ones, and it just kind of brought out absolutely what we were just saying before about the fact that, you know, this is a kind of institution that will close ranks in the face of any kinds of criticism, and the idea that oh god, I'm sorry that I'm slowing down, because I just feel like there's so much to be said about this, and it's so upsetting once you actually
Start thinking about
start
it.
to think about it. And there's a kind of wall of it's like a kind of gulf of experience between the people who are policed by the police and who know what it's like, and who see how the system works because they're on the sharp end of it, and then the people who don't, and that's kind of, you know, the white affluent sections of the population who are, you know, often the ones who are given the kind of authority to speak on in the media, in universities, to write the books and that sort of thing. And the level of just naivety and ignorance among that group of people is just so overwhelming that it kind of hits you like a oh dear God, where do I even begin? In talking about this, I mean, so the example of that Injustice documentary that I mentioned, so yeah, there've been almost 2,000 deaths in custody, police custody or following police contact in the UK, and not a single officer has been convicted for those deaths. But then this documentary about the experiences of families trying to kind of navigate the aftermath of that kind of violence, the documentary was actually threatened with legal action. So any venue that tried to screen it was told that they would be sued, and this was like very effective in preventing the thing from actually being, you know, launched and viewed. But that kind of goes on behind the scenes and under the radar, and it's just a matter of what don't you see.
Yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about what's happening right now, and what I find speaks to exactly what you're saying is that we have a number of examples from just the past 3 days of white people co-opting the protests in order to advance agendas that draw in police attention, or worse, returning the narrative. I was thinking about what you're saying about one of the big tensions of talking about and discussing and managing and moving forwards in these contexts being that there is a big community that see police enforcement as vital and positive, but also as a means of protecting their rights, whatever, and have no concept of the idea that the people they think they are signing a social contract with about this sort of way of existing, way of being part of society with. And I'm thinking particularly of people of color, of queer people, of disabled people, even, like depending, and all of the intersections that go with that. Like, don't see the police working for them. They, or associations that, you know, the prison systems and the justice systems working for or with them. And I'm not going to get into this, but I spoke a lot in the white spaces in my life in the last couple of days about a particular person in Salt Lake City who produced a weapon from their car and attempted to shoot protesters, and was not charged and was released within an hour and given airtime on numerous across America broadcasting platforms. But the people that trashed that person's car who tried to murder a protester are the people who are in custody right now. And one of the things I find exciting about this playlist, in I guess a negative way, but in also in an invigorating sense, is that there's some communication about this tension that people like to move away from. And I do think that that's what Fuck the Police particularly does very well, because you have this parody where you've got this sort of sense of comedy and this sense of action and this sense of resistance coming together with a critique of the fact that the system doesn't work for everyone, and but also that it was designed not to work for everyone. And I think that's what people don't like to acknowledge. And like, I find the song Why by the Specials really interesting, because it's a B-side to Ghost Town by the Specials, and so that all came out around the riots in the UK and in England, primarily in the 80s, so around Brixton and Toxteth and so on. And this song about why am I only allowed to live when you are protected by thousands of police, this being the opposite side to what is it like to live in a space post rioting, like the fact that these songs came together, that people on the other side of the system are seeing them as intertwined, not as separate phenomenon that sometimes coincide. And I think that that's also a social privilege. It's the idea that you don't get one without the other. And yeah, it's a fascinating question.
A theme that kind of came out to me from the from that song Why was very much this kind of connection between the law in practice and the far right. So the kind of I was thinking of the one of the tracks from a few weeks ago, which was Awate's track. So one of the cases that he had to deal with was being arrested at a protest against the EDL, which is the English Defence League, which is a kind of far right kind of extremely racist and Islamophobic organization, and that you know, as is kind of if you kind of go to any counter protests to the far right, you will see the way that the police kind of intervene in those situations is very heavily directed against the people who are opposing the far right. And this was the case with Awate being arrested, and what he was charged with was and I think this is really interesting and brings out the kind of point of the Clash song really clearly. So the Clash song, Know Your Rights. The kind of double meaning of that is, you know, on the one hand, we think that the rights are the kind of thing that we have that can protect us from a police state, right? Rights are the rule of law, and having rights means that you know, the police can ultimately be kind of you know, kept in line, and yet in practice, which of those rights are actually enforceable, and how are they enforced, and who gets to have them and who doesn't? When you look at that, you kind of see again the operation of the penal system has much more in common with institutions that we've like the institution of slavery, for example, which in the United States context is like completely crucial for understanding what mass incarceration is doing today. Is kind of you know, directed against descendants of the very same population. But the case with Awate, which I bring up, is because he was charged with a public order offence, which is a really kind of fascinating concept in itself, because public order is very much about what we were talking about before, what is kind of business as usual, what's in line with the existing kind of hierarchies in society, and what doesn't challenge them. And so public order offences have been formulated by the authorities in the last few hundred years in particular, so as to criminalise any kind of coming together of the oppressed in a way that might actually have some power to change things. And that's what the charge of unlawful assembly was kind of designed to do back in the start of the 19th century, directed against sort of people protesting for particularly in the northern industrial cities, for greater political rights for the working class. Unlawful assembly, public order charges used to suppress that, and to kind of justify the forms of violence we saw, for example, with the Peterloo massacre, what's known as the Peterloo massacre, when the kind of army were sent in with sabres to attack a crowd of people of all ages, and many were killed. But that's the kind of history of public order law. And then we see it today. The Public Order Act of 1986 is absolutely standardly used against any form of kind of progressive or emancipatory protest against the status quo. The status quo being kind of how things are, existing power structures and systems of oppression. So Awate is protesting against the far right, and you might think, well, naively, you might think, well, you know, he's against racism. We live in a society where officially the state is against racism. What's he doing? He's, you know, chanting with a group of people, you know, standing up and using his free speech, you might think, to shout about how much he disagrees with the far right and kind of fascists that want to I mean, that's a term with a whole load to discuss in it, but he's arrested and charged with public order offence. Section 5 of the Public Order Act, which is very interesting because it doesn't require you to have really done anything except to have said something or displayed words or signs that might cause someone to feel harassment, alarm, or distress. What he said in particular was "fuck your flag" and "fuck your queen," I think, to the far right nationalists. And he was not only charged with this public order offence, but with a racially aggravated public order offence. So that kind of what might seem again like a kind of progressive sort of law, which says, you know, it's really bad to hate crimes, again, racism is really bad, so we've got a law which says you know, this kind of like racist hate speech is going to be targeted. Who's it used against? It's used against a black guy who's protesting against the far right. And yeah, I just thought that was a really interesting theme in the tracks, was asking actually what is the relation between, you know, the overseer on the plantation of slavery and the officer today. What is the relation between the kind of the police officer and the National Front? Sometimes has been a great deal of overlap.
Yeah, it's kind of have two separate thoughts thinking about the playlist there. Sort of the anti-fascism point that's kind of an undercurrent in overt in certain tracks and understated but present in others. It is so central to the Schrei nach Liebe track from Die Ärzte as an intentionally anti-fascist song, but produced by a punk band that are parodying the aesthetic of what neo-Nazism looks like in Germany at a time where, so it was produced, I think it was their first single when they reformed in the early 90s, and so it was produced as sort of as a second wave of sort of conservatism in this particular area. So racially aggravated specifically was gaining more traction again in Germany, and there's definitely an ebb and flow in that conversation, but specifically how we talk about who has power. And I thought it was really exciting to see a song that is written as a commentary not on racism but on racists, if that makes sense. And I mean, this is that song is deliberately mocking, and it's deliberately aggressive and confrontational, and there's something there that appeals to sort of the energy of many of the other songs about sort of spirited resistance, but also understanding the power of the communities that you're speaking to, which is sometimes a little bit lost in general anti-racist discourse, where there's so conversations about who racism can be perpetrated against and who racism most significantly affects, and the blind spots in many anti-racist processes, which include sort of the rights of Indigenous people and often the queer community within the Black and Indigenous communities as well. And so that I thought that was a kind of a fascinating sort of link on there. But also you were talking about the difference between the slavers on the plantations and where we are now. And I recently read a book called Remembered, which is a novel but based on an immense amount of research by Yvonne Battle Felton, excuse me. And it's sort of about a multi-generational story beginning during slavery and ending in the early 1910s. And the thing that really comes out of this novel is the idea that people who are Black and people of Black heritage continue to feel chains, like, and it's an undercurrent of that. And that's one of the reasons, even though it wasn't directly conscious in my mind, that I picked two tracks from the turn of the 1920s into the 1930s in America. So that move from the Harlem Renaissance, where a group of Black intellectuals and artists were trying to create a new place for Blackness to exist and thrive within the Black community and not be commodified by white audiences, but simultaneously this undescribable struggle between sort of the different interpretations of law and how segregation was being enforced in lots of different places. So I was just thinking about what you're saying about those sort of parallels moving through. One of the things that I value most about music as a conduit for understanding concepts like racism and anti-racism is that it gives you insights into points in time, and like the pairing of why with Ghost Town, that this is specifically thinking about wreckage and what comes afterwards. And whereas the two songs, so that's Black and Blue and Supper Time in from 1929 and 1933 were when those two were written, but also from very different perspectives, even though they were written from different vantage points, even though they seem to be about the same person. Help us to understand what a conversation was then. And I found it so funny. I just read Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, which is a seminal, a seminal text of the period, if you like. And in, I think it's the prologue or the first chapter, the character hears Louis Armstrong sing Black and Blue, and it pulls them out of the sort of dream that they're having. And I just like, I can't ignore this song. I'd already put Supper Time on, but I had to put it in because it is such a moment in time.
Yeah, well, I mean, what the the word that you used that really jumped out to me there was wreckage, and I think that's a really important word for thinking about concept for thinking about policing and the penal system. So one of the like the uh the Supper Time song, it kind of spoke to me about the uh the wreckage that's done to families and kind of human bonds and communities through kind of incarceration and policing. But this the something that's very often missing from discussions of what the impact of incarceration is, for instance, is what's the impact on all of the social networks and the kind of that are ripped asunder by having people locked away, and the huge the very kind of gendered in the sense that kind of oppressive gender, so women suffer more in the harm that does to kind of economically and socially and sort of culturally and in every sense to communities. But then also, I guess the thought that policing legitimizes itself by pointing to very real social problems that that there is a great deal of violence in society that is not just violence perpetrated directly by the police, right? There's many other forms of violence, like, for example, 2 women a week being killed by their partner or ex-partner in this country. And and very often this will be kind of pointed to as a way to legitimize more violence from the violence of kind of prisons and the violence of policing. And what that kind of, I mean, I always find it completely kind of ridiculous in a way, or bizarre, that for example, violence against women is so often the first thing that people go to when you make any critical comment about the police. They say, oh, who's going to protect the vulnerable women? And of course this is protecting women from male violence is one of the things that the police are notoriously awful at, because it's not what they're there for. That is not violence that disrupts the existing social order. It's kind of violence that upholds it. And so police responses to sexual assault, for example, are like notoriously re-traumatizing and offensive. And I mean, I don't mean offensive in the sense that somebody is offended. I mean people who go to the police because they've been sexually assaulted have their data harvested from their phones and then are reported to the immigration authorities. That's what I mean by offensive. That I mean real kind of material harm. Where you've got a kind of cycle of violence, which is something that Frantz Fanon, for example, talks about in the context of colonial oppression and kind of colonial policing. And aside, I put on Masters of War to this playlist partly because in the history of policing, the distinction between the police and the military has been and connections between the police and military have been very interesting and fluid. And in the kind of colonial context is where many of the techniques of modern policing have been developed. And they've been developed by a kind of militarized police. And police is always all kind of already, we talk about militarization of policing now, but many policing techniques kind of came from these contexts of basically occupied territories, war zones, and the techniques are kind of tried out there and then brought back and used against the domestic population. And that's something that's so frequently observed in the history of policing. It sometimes gets called the colonial boomerang effect.
Yeah.
Kind of the violence is thrown
Send
out
it
to the
away,
colonies and then it comes back.
Exactly. Yeah, it's interesting you say that. There's sort of two things that come to mind when just thinking about both those songs and what you were saying. And so Supper Time's written about a woman whose husband has been lynched. And one of the things that I think that we often fail to discuss when we talk about police brutality is the empowerment, the historic empowerment of mob rule to support the police. And Supper Time always makes me think of, I think it's the beginning chapter of I Know Why the Caged Bird Sings by Dr. Maya Angelou, where she talks about the sheriff coming to warn her uncle who is disabled and therefore can't run, that the clan is coming to get someone. So the sheriff doesn't stop the clan coming. The sheriff tells the black people to hide. And that is one of the mechanisms of understanding police as well, is this isn't something we contain. So but that is a form of complicitness, and a journey that we haven't really, I think, as a society, particularly in the UK, though it was different, it manifested differently here, or in America, has really confronted in a meaningful way yet. And again, that sort of tradition of, who gets to decide what societal power is and how it is enforced, being taken away, not just from the institutions, but also to individual communities that align with the police. And that goes all the way back to your point at the beginning about who is it for and who does it serve. And the other thing I wanted to just pick out is in what you were saying about sort of violence against women. It's so striking that in all of the current conversations, and I don't just mean this week and weekend, but in recent months and years in the UK and in America, the discrepancy of coverage of Black women who have been killed in incarceration or in custody. And there's a brilliant chapter in an edited collection called Can We All Be Feminists, that specifically speaks to this and sort of talks about the problem of acknowledging how intersections interact with who is targeted, while not minimizing the fears that specifically Black men and Black trans people experience in relation to both the police and the carceral systems. So it's just something that sort of occurred to me. We're sort of coming up to our time, so I want to throw over to you. There's a number of tracks we didn't cover. So is there anything you specifically want to pick out that we haven't covered?
So I think one track which I popped on there, which probably needs just a bit of explanation, is the Schubert song. And Näher des Geliebten, and which is based on a setting of a Goethe poem about your beloved being who is far away, and yet they are near when you hear the booming of the waves and when you kind of when you think of them. And it's kind of romantic classic. The reason why I put it on there for this week is because that very offence that I was talking about, the Public Order Act 1986, Section 5, Schubert was actually arrested under a rather comparable law. In 1820, in the kind of context of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, there was a kind of great crackdown on political radicalism, and especially on kind of societies of students and artists and other dangerous kinds of things. And one of Schubert's close friends, Johann Sen, was imprisoned and then deported for political offences, as in they were called political offences. I think that what we've been discussing kind of shows that the institution of policing and the creation of the kind of criminalisation in general is political. But Sen was deported, and Schubert was arrested for, quote, of inveighing against officials with foul and opprobrious language, which I think means saying insulting things to cops, which is what you can be prosecuted under Section 5 of the Public Order Act for. Although we only have the words of those officials to go on, so who knows what really happened.
ACAB, goodness me.
All cats are beautiful. Absolutely. What about you? Did you have any final?
I think the thing that the thing I really felt when I was listening to the playlist, which I think is easy to lose in these conversations, is the amount of energy and the amount of impetus. And I think particularly where we are now, I mean, one of my friends went missing in Minneapolis this week. He's fine. He left his phone at home and didn't tell anyone where he was going, which was smart actually, but also terrifying.
In fact, Teen Vogue has put out a article with advice on attending, what to think about when you're attending a protest, which I highly recommend.
Cover up your tattoos.
Take a look at. And Green and Black Cross is another organisation that has really helpful advice on the kind of protest safety and kind of knowing your rights, which can be helpful, even if we also know that in practice, what the police enforce is not necessarily what the rights look like on paper.
Yeah, absolutely. But that's kind of where I was going with it, is I don't mean knowledge is power in a superficial sense, but the only way that we can encounter and tackle and critically deconstruct and reimagine, potentially going all the way back to our utopic conversation in week one, these kind of structures is through energy and through intention. And that's something that's so clear in these songs, whether they were songs written for protest or written about a moment in time or parodying a sentiment, or not to go back to it for too long, but Supper Time is particularly interesting because it's from a musical, and it's written by a white Jew who had fled to America. And there's this big tension in musicals through the 30s into the 40s, even into the early 50s, about how to write about anti-Black racism specifically, when all of the authors of musicals that were having major commercial success were white or experienced white privilege. And this is one of those songs that I think cuts through that in a really impactful way and talks about empathy and shared experience, and also disrupting comfortable spaces. You don't go, let's go, if I said a 1930s musical theatre review to you, people go Top Hats and Fred and Ginger, and they don't think of Ethel Waters sitting on a nearly bare stage singing about having to carry on with her life after her husband had been lynched. And I think that what I'm trying to say is that there's space for these conversations everywhere. And one of the ways of, one of the beauties of the playlist as a whole is showing how there's also space in so many different communities as well. And that it's not just about, the radical educated left that we hear so much about, sort of taking. I feel like people should come marching through the back, but you know what I mean. There's a weaponization of conversation that takes place here about who is protesting and who is protested against, and the conversation becomes about who those communities are and not about what is being said. And the beauty of this playlist is that it's a lot of people saying it in a lot of different ways across centuries. And we need to hold on to that.
There's that line in Masters of War, which is like, you that hide behind walls, that hide behind desks, I just want you to know that I see through your masks. And I think this idea of hiding behind a desk, and kind of being a kind of pen pushing bureaucrat who doesn't think about what the consequences are of the systems that you're kind of involved in administering and take for granted, and it is and also of kind of violence being hidden behind walls, so that there is this gulf between the people who experience it and know about it intimately and yet are not listened to, and the people who kind of and we could turn it around and apply it to the kind of commentariat class, and large chunks of academia as well,
Mhm.
hide behind desks, don't have a fucking clue about what the law means in practice, and
Yeah.
so yeah, maybe that's uh, just want you to know that we see through your mask. That's many, I guess, what the playlist shows is that many people do
Yeah.
see
We
through
see
that,
you.
and yeah, many, and in a lot of ways, the kind of the people who are kind of waking up to it now are behind.
Yeah. And that it's not, I mean,
and to catch up with the
yeah,
resistance that's already happening. We don't need to reinvent the wheel.
yeah, stop performing discovering racism. We've known about it, and police brutality. Like, we've
I mean,
known about it for a while.
everyone starts somewhere, and it's like the moments of the kind of aha moments of fucking hell, it's like this is something that, for example, going along to a protest can often teach you.
Yeah.
Like we don't just like learn everything in advance and then go out and apply the perfect theory. We're always already in the world and entangled in all of these kind of structures of power and resistance, and kind of like getting stuck in and taking a risk is how we learn. And so yeah, I wasn't saying catch up in a sense of like, you know, shame on anybody for not knowing something. The way that the system is functioned is to try to prevent people from knowing about it. So no shame there, but how we learn is by getting stuck in and kind of solidarity to and showing solidarity with other people who are resisting. So maybe that's a
On
good
that
point to
note,
end.
yes. Donate to the bail fund.
Absolutely. And have conversations. I think that's a really crucial thing. Have conversations with the people in your life who are gonna turn around and, you know, point to the wreckage that is our society to justify more wrecking balls. And just be like when are we gonna stop this cycle of violence? That's not the way. Justifying more police brutality is not the way.
We had President Trump say the age-old phrase about when looting starts, shooting starts. But we have to recognize that the shooting started first, and it's a cycle, as you say. And yeah, absolutely. Have conversations, read things, find out about the anti-carceral movement.
I mean, one way to describe the foundation of the American state is as the looting of indigenous people of their land and resources. I mean,
and the looting of black bodies under slavery.
Yeah. Okay.
On that note. Take care, everybody.
Goodbye. We'll be back soon. We'll be back.